We've made our Canucks list that contains a bunch of hockey players, and we wrote a loop that goes through and prints out the first name of each person on the list. Sometimes instead of printing out the person on the list, you actually want to turn around and find somebody who's on the list. So here's an example of code that goes through the loop and attempts to find somebody. The first trick when you're looking for something is to make a variable that starts out as empty and just says I haven't found anything yet. And then later on, when you find somebody, you can fill in that variable to point to the one that you've actually found. The loop goes through every hockey player on the list. So again, when you're starting to read loops, the easiest thing to do whenever you see a loop from now on is just say, this is going to go through every hockey player on the list, because that's usually what loops are intending to do. So we'll go through every hockey player on the list, we'll retrieve the first name and the last name of a player, and we'll check to see whether or not their first name is Daniel and their last name is Sedin. If that's the correct player, then we'll set the found player variable, the one we initially created as null, to the person that we found, and we'll use the break command to stop the loop so that the loop drops out here, because there's no use continuing on to search for things once you've found Daniel on the list. This is probably the traditional way of doing a search, and this is the style of if statement where you're only attempting to do something, or you're trying to restrict things until you find exactly the one that you're looking for. The other way of writing the loop is to do what we've done for a lot of the method calls that we've been writing, is to essentially treat it as a method. We'll start out and we'll set our found player to null. That's just reusing that variable we had up there. And then we'll turn around and we'll go through the loop in the same sort of way through all of the players on the list and see if we can find somebody. But in this case, what we're doing is we're going to kick out the bad part of things that aren't correct until we're only left with something that's good. So notice in this style, similar to what we've done in the kick out the bad style in method calls, what we do is we say, if the name doesn't match Daniel, then I guess that's not the right one, so let's just go back up to the top of the loop and get the next person. If the name doesn't match Daniel, let's get back up to the top of the loop again. Sooner or later you might find somebody whose name is Daniel. In that case, you now check to see whether or not their last name equals Sedin. If it's not Sedin, then I guess we still haven't found the right one, because it was Daniel but it wasn't Sedin, so we'll go back up to the loop and try again. Eventually, if you do get a match for both Daniel and Sedin, then at that point you know that you found the correct player, and you can come down outside of the loop and you could turn around and print them out. This second style, even though it's probably not the most modern style, it tends to make it easier to read the loop, and it also tends to make it easier to debug, because if the if statement goes back up to the top, you know exactly what didn't match. In this case, if you're using the debugger on this sort of statement, and for some reason you don't get inside of the if statement, you don't know whether it failed because the first name was not Daniel, or whether the first name was not Sedin. And the other problem with this style, as we've seen with the method calls, is that every time you add a restriction, this line gets longer and longer and longer. Here we add restrictions by adding a separate if statement. It used to be in the old days that break and continue were somewhat bad words in the language, and people tried to avoid them, but my argument is that this style is probably the clearest style to use, and it's the easiest style for the debugger to see, and it's also easier to add new cases in, which are restrictions for why you wouldn't find a match.